Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Wednesday, June 25th. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Coming up, one of the next items on the chopping block in Congress is $1 billion of federal funding for public media.
We're going to come out the other side for sure, but it will be something that people notice on the air.
We speak with KVPR's general manager about what that could mean for this station. But first, these headlines. Anti-abortion groups are speaking out against a bill in the state legislature. It protects pharmacists and healthcare providers in California from penalties for legally dispensing mifepristone. Greg Burt is with the California Family Council.
Shielding providers from accountability and preventing law enforcement access to prescription records without a subpoena. The bill is dangerously prioritizing abortion politics over women's real health and real safety.
But supporters say the bill is needed because of growing attacks on reproductive rights and because other states are rolling back reproductive health care access. Adriana Benedict is with Hey Jane, a provider of virtual telehealth abortion care.
While intimidation is not new to our providers, the last 6 months have seen an undeniable escalation of threats that seek to use fear to accomplish reproductive health care bans, which cannot be accomplished through the ballot box.
The bill has passed the Senate Business Professions and Economic Development Committee. It heads next to appropriations. Supervisors in Fresno County unanimously passed an ordinance yesterday that goes after illegal animal breeders. Officials say unregulated cat and dog breeding is causing overcrowded shelters and overpopulated streets. The new ordinance seeks to do 3 things. It will require breeder permits, limit the number of animal litters a breeder can produce, and restrict animal sales by breeders. Supervisor Gary Bredefeld co-authored the ordinance.
We're going to monitor swap meets and places where they sell these animals on street corners in front of businesses, online. We're going to be monitoring social media.
Those who violate the new ordinance could face a $1,000 fine, as well as a misdemeanor and 6 months in jail. A specialized task force within the California National Guard that tackles wildfires is currently short-staffed as the wildfire season sets in. The governor's office says the so-called Task Force Rattlesnake is operating at 40% capacity. That's because so many of the Guardsmen are deployed to Los Angeles. That's where President Trump moved to federalize the Guard in response to anti-ICE protests. A federal judge has temporarily allowed the president to keep control of the Guard.
Support for Central Valley Daily comes from the members of KVPR. Join at $8 or more per month and access ad-free NPR podcasts through NPR Plus. Give now at kvpr.org/donate.
And now to our main story. Earlier this month, the House of Representatives voted to rescind $1.1 billion for public media across the country. That funding flows to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or CPB, and is then distributed to public media stations across the U.S., including this one, KVPR. Rescinding this funding from public media is just one of the things in a larger package proposed by President Trump. And to be clear, the goal would be to take back funding for public media that is already approved. The proposal narrowly passed in the House, and now we wait for a vote from the Senate. In our news updates, we've covered funding cuts to a number of agencies and organizations over the last few months. Many of them are a result of the Department of Government Efficiency, which has sought to rein in government spending. But today, we will talk about how funding cuts are even affecting us. Now that public media is in the government's crosshairs, we figured who better to explain what's at stake than ourselves. For today's episode, we are going to be the story, and we hope you bear with us and also learn a little bit about how we operate here at the station. For this, the Central Valley Daily team invited KVPR's president and general manager, Joe Moore, to the studio to discuss the state of public media and the impact of potential funding cuts to local stations like KVPR. What's certain is that any cuts will hit some stations harder than others. And a note for you, our listener, in order to preserve our editorial independence in the KVPR newsroom, we did not share our questions with Joe ahead of time. So to begin, Joe explains how much funding KVPR actually gets from CPB.
The funding varies year to year a little bit, and it's based on how much private support stations raise. There's also an audience factor that's included in the formula. Last fiscal year, KVPR received $165,000 in the form of a community service grant. This current fiscal year, we received $189,000. So our projections for next year are around $175,000, kind of like midway in between. So that would be funding that helps KVPR purchase the programs our listeners hear. It also helps sustain station operations. So we would definitely be impacted by this. However, many stations in more rural areas, smaller states, would even be more impacted. In some cases, I think there's some stations that receive upwards of 50% of their funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So KVPR is not going anywhere if this funding goes away, but it would be hurt, and our programs would be hurt.
So with a lot of grants and things, there are strings attached as to how you can spend the money or things like that. With the CPB funding, are there strings attached, or is this just a portion that's given to the stations?
It's unrestricted funding. However, there are rules that stations have to abide by in terms of transparency, in terms of accountability, open meeting requirements, and things like posting our audited financial statements, all of which you can find at kvpr.org. Now, the administration and its executive order is attempting to put a new restriction in preventing stations from using their federal funding to purchase programs from NPR and PBS. We believe that is not supported by law, and NPR and 3 stations from Colorado are suing to overturn that executive order on First Amendment grounds.
You know, NPR and PBS have been in conservatives' crosshairs for a while. This isn't the first time there have been attempts to defund NPR, as they say. I want to quote the executive order issued in May by the president. This is when he directed CPB to stop funding NPR and PBS. The order says, quote, "Government funding of news media in this environment is not only outdated and unnecessary, but corrosive to the appearance of journalistic independence." What do you say to critics who agree with the president?
You know, I think it's interesting because I think it's also important to understand the context and what local stations are actually doing in their communities. Local stations are the ones that are providing, in many cases, the only news coverage, local news coverage in many communities that are increasingly becoming news deserts. Stations like KVPR are leaders in emergency response. We're responsible for disseminating emergency alerts to all other broadcast stations. Now, I understand there are critics, and certainly I think many reasonable Americans would cite a need for the federal government to examine its expenditures, and certainly this is something that's been a legitimate point of debate over the years. I often hear a criticism that says, you know, Joe, why can't your station just survive like the other commercial stations can? And I always point out to people there's a key distinction there. As a non-commercial station, the federal government prohibits KVPR from engaging in the very business model that supports those commercial stations. We are not allowed to sell advertising, nor do we wish to sell advertising. And I think that's one of the reasons that Congress realized that we do need to provide some level of support. And I think a lot of people have in many years talked about the benefit of public-private partnerships. And I think public media is one of the best public-private partnerships that you could point to an example of. You have a station like KVPR that receives 7% of its support from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and then matches that with a 93% of its support from private sources. And, so
like listeners.
Yeah, listeners, business sponsors, events, nonprofit foundations. So we're able to take those federal dollars and leverage them to great extent to achieve a lot of public good.
You know, I think a lot of folks don't always understand how public media operates. Arguably, part of our conversation has been a little in the weeds looking at our budget and things like that. So why should listeners care right now?
Well, it's really important because many stations will make it through this. KVPR is going to make it through this. There are many stations, though, that will not make it through this. I am doubtful that public media will remain a service across both radio and television that serves all 50 states if the defunding efforts go through. If you look in Alaska, if you look in even parts of Arizona, New Mexico, the rural Midwest, the Deep South, you're going to see a lot of stations probably go away.
I want to circle back real quick to this rescission process. So I'd like to know, you were recently in Washington, D.C. to lobby for public media funding. I'd love for you to briefly kind of recap that experience. I believe you met with our local representatives. Now, for folks who might not know, the House of Representatives did approve this rescission package, as you noted. The Senate still needs to approve it, so we're kind of in a waiting game. So how were folks that you spoke with prior to the vote? How did they vote? How do you feel about that? Kind of give us a rundown on all that.
Yeah, I met with representatives' offices from both sides of the aisle. We wound up meeting with Congressman Jim Costa, as well as Senators Adam Schiff and Alex Padilla, and then also met with members of the staffs of Vince Fong and David Valadao. We had constructive conversations across the board, and I really appreciate the opportunity to engage with our elected leaders here. I think all of them understand what KVPR brings to our Valley communities. As far as our local Valley delegation, you had support in the House from Jim Costa and Adam Gray, and you had Vince Fong oppose the measure, and David Valadao was quoted in Politico and a few other publications, the Washington Examiner, as saying he had concerns about the cuts to public media funding, but ultimately he voted to approve the rescission request. Now it goes to the Senate, and there is a July 18th deadline to get this rescission process final approval.
So imminently.
Yes.
If the funding cut's approved, what's that mean for KVPR, and what's that mean for public media at large?
Yeah, I mean, I think public media as a whole, the system is trying to grapple with exactly what this is going to mean. We know that I've already seen a couple of stations, LAist in Southern California, preemptively announced some staffing cuts. Wisconsin Public Radio announced that they're cutting some local programs. I think KVPR would try to address this in a multifaceted way. As I said, this is $175,000. We would be looking at making some changes with our overall program offerings as far as national programs, as that's a significant expense to the station. We would want to, if at all possible, avoid staffing cuts, but I can't rule that out at this point. We're also talking with major donors. The station also has a great opportunity coming up to pay down the debt on our broadcast center. We're going on 10 years in this new facility, and we have the end of our 10-year note coming up. So a balloon payment is due there. We're working on major donors to pay off that. And if we do that, especially if we can accelerate paying down that debt, which is the only debt KVPR owns, we would be able to achieve some operational savings. So additional fundraising, trimming expenses, some structural changes, and looking at every option we have to try to address this. We're going to come out the other side for sure, but it will be something that people notice on the air.
KVPR President and General Manager Joe Moore, thank you so much.
Thanks, Liz.
And that's today's show. And just a reminder, you can always reach out to us with feedback or story ideas. Just email podcast@kvpr.org. We hope you keep listening to us in the days, weeks, and months to come. And remember, KVPR is your public radio station. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden, Carrie Klein, and KVPR, with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.
Planet Money helps you understand the economy. We find the people at the center of the story.
Garbage in New York, that was like a controlled substance.
We show you how money influences everything.
Tell me what you like by telling me how you spend your money.
And we dig until we get answers.
I had a bad feeling you were going to bring that up.
Planet Money finds out. All you have to do is listen. The Planet Money Podcast from NPR.